All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to section 3 of our comparative criminology course. So today we're going to talk about counting crime, okay? Now, this can be extremely difficult for a lot of reasons, but number one is that crime isn't the same everywhere, okay? Most crime is really just socially constructed, i.e., there are societies where a certain activity is seen as criminal and societies where that activity is seen as non-criminal, and there's not really an objective way to define exactly what constitutes a crime and what doesn't. Now, on one end, there's things like homicide, which is considered a crime fairly universally. But even within that, like, what is considered a homicide? So in some countries, euthanasia, i.e., a person is terminally ill, knows they're going to be dying in a few months anyway, very painfully, so they ask a doctor to help them end their life early. Is the doctor helping that person die a homicide or not? Different countries have very different answers to that question. There are lots of countries where homosexuality is still illegal, even as of the recording of this video. And then there are certain countries where you're allowed to perform what are called honor killings, i.e., a member of your family has brought shame to the family, you are legally allowed to murder them. So crime is not something that is objective. What constitutes a crime and what constitutes a non-crime is very, very different depending on where you live and how you were raised. The other thing we have to understand is that when you count things, a lot of times there's a tendency to kind of take the meaning out of it, to kind of reduce it to numbers, takes away the understanding of what each individual criminal act really means within the society, to the victim, to the offender, all those things. A good example here is littering. There are lots of cities, major urban areas around the world where, somebody throws a bubblegum wrapper on the street and it's nothing. It's just people do that. But then there are areas like the city of Singapore, city/country of Singapore, where littering can get you severe corporal punishment. So littering in Singapore and littering in Rio de Janeiro are going to be seen as two very, very different things by both offender and the police and the court system and just kind of the society of those cities. So if you just count the number of litterers or the number of littering incidents, that's really not capturing that gigantic difference between kind of the understanding and the act of littering, right? We need to make sure we're not reducing crime into just another number. We don't want to make all car thefts seem the same. We don't want to make all assaults seem the same, because they are very, very different depending on time and space and victim and all those other things. Now, official statistics. We went over this a little bit in the last section, but you have to remember that these are collected in different ways for different purposes, right? The way that the United States collects our national official statistics on crime is with the FBI's Uniform Crime Report, and they take those from police, whereas other countries might collect national crime data in other ways. Maybe they get it from the court system. So you have to be really careful about how these crimes are getting reported, even within official statistics, because if a country really wants an international help with drug trafficking, they think, oh, we have a really bad drug trafficking problem. We want to get UN money or Interpol money or EU money or whatever to try to combat that. They might kind of focus on collecting drug crime data a little more purposefully than they focus on things like car thefts. Definitions, again, every crime and every criminal act is defined differently, jurisdiction to jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Even within the United States, like the definition of burglary can change state to state to state. The definition of assault can change state to state to state. So you really have to be careful to make sure you're focusing on whether these definitions are at least close enough to be comparable. Now, the dark figure of crime, again, we also talked about that a little bit in the last section, but remember that not only does it depend on did the victim report, but it also depends on police priorities, right? If police are sending out lots and lots of patrol in high auto theft areas, that's going to change how many auto thefts they record than whether they don't really care so much about auto thefts, but they really want to send patrols down to the bar areas. Every city has a street or a small neighborhood that's famous for its bars and nightlife and things. Maybe they want to send all their patrol down there, in which case you're going to get a lot more DUIs and assaults and other kind of criminal acts associated with that kind of activity. You also have to worry about the availability of technical expertise, right? It can be difficult to maintain these systems that record and collect data if you don't have somebody that is capable of doing that and working for the amount of pay you're offering, right? So if we have a budget of $30,000 a year, there's probably not going to be many cybercrime experts willing to work for that here in the United States. Whereas, in a third world country, maybe $30,000 for a cybercrime expert is plenty. But maybe there's no cybercrime experts to be found. The availability of people to do the job of recording official statistics and investigating the crimes that go into the official statistics. So maybe we don't have any expertise on wildlife crime. So wildlife crimes happen and we kind of either ignore it or we aren't able to investigate it or we aren't able to catch the criminal because we don't have any experts in wildlife crime within our police department. You also have to have a commitment to good data collection, right? There's a lot of police departments around the world, in every country, where they just don't care enough to collect data. Now, hopefully in your country, kind of the higher ups will force them to do it anyway, even if they don't want to do it, even if they don't want to pay for it, don't want to, even if they're, say, corrupt and want to intentionally mess up good data collection. Hopefully there's some oversight that will force them to do it right and do it the way it's supposed to be done, but that's not always the case. Whether it's due to corruption or laziness or incompetence or whatever other kind of motivation you want to name, there's a decent chance that there's a lot of police departments in your country where they just aren't committed to good data collection. Now, there are a lot of official statistics gathered by supranational bodies. And that doesn't mean supranational as in, your country wears a cape and flies around and solves crime. Supranational as in more than one nation, right? Especially since the end of World War II, we've seen the rise of a lot of these different supranational bodies. The most famous one within the field of criminal justice is Interpol, or the International Police. I think that's 99% sure that's what it stands for, although it might stand for that in French. Interpol is a collection of countries that have gotten together in order to kind of share police data with each other. And we're going to go over Interpol a little bit more in a future slide. But they are a really interesting organization that helps kind of keep all the countries within the grouping aware and alerted and gives them lots of great data. There's the UN, the United Nations, right? They have a subset of that organization just about crime. And they collect criminal statistics from each kind of region that the UN is divided into. So there's one for Asia, and there's one for Africa, and there's one for, each of these different regions around the world, and each of those regions is responsible for collecting data on crime from each of the countries within that region. And then, just as a third example, there's the Council of Europe, right, which is either tied to the EU or not separate from the EU, but essentially those same countries, where they collect crime data from each of the European countries under their umbrella. If you want to look at kind of supranational statistics from a non kind of governmental association, there's the International Crime Victimization Survey. Now, if you've taken a few of my previous courses, you probably have heard of the National Crime Victimization Survey, which is from the United States, started many, many years ago. And essentially they do either in-person or phone interviews of different households chosen at random across the United States, and ask them about their victimization. Have you had a car stolen in the last 6 months? Has anybody in the house been murdered in the last 6 months? Has anybody in the house been a victim of an assault in the last, all those kind of questions. And then they compile all that data together and say, based on this random sample we took, there were, we believe over the course of the country, extrapolated from our sample, there's been this many car thefts and this many assaults and this many of everything. And that's an attempt to kind of get around that dark figure of crime. Well, a few decades after we started that in the United States, they started doing that internationally. I want to say it was the very late 20th century when this started. But it's essentially the same idea. You go to a bunch of different countries around the world, you pick a random sample, ask them, hey, have you been a victim of this crime? Have you been a victim of that crime? And then based on, sampling and statistical techniques, they're kind of fairly confident in saying there's been about this number of auto thefts in the world. There's been about this number of assaults in the world. And obviously there's some statistical wiggle room there. It'll be, 10,000 plus or minus 1,000 or something like that. But it's definitely, assuming they're doing their jobs right, which I believe they are, it is a pretty good snapshot of how much crime is happening in the world. Now, when you're looking at official statistics, the best way to do it and the safest way to do it, based on all the issues we've already talked about, is to look at one geographic area and look at their crime over time. Because then you don't have to worry about, like, are we comparing apples to apples, or are we comparing, a country where homicide is one thing versus a country where homicide is a very different thing. So if you look at crime from one place over time, we can, we can assume, hopefully, that we're using the same definition and the same measurement techniques, and we're measuring crime for the same purposes, or at least similar purposes, for that whole time. So it controls for those problems at least a little bit. Again, it's not perfect, but you can see kind of trends in crime in one jurisdiction, and if every jurisdiction shows essentially the same trend, we might not be able to compare country to country, but we can say that trend is probably a worldwide trend, right? And so here we have two graphs. The one furthest over there is violent crime in the United States from 1990 to 2020, and as you can see, it's going down a lot. It's smoothed out a little bit over the past few years, but there is a dramatic drop between 1990 and 2020. And then the closer graph right here is crime in the UK. And again, we see a really, really sharp drop overall. Not every year and not every jurisdiction, but a pretty significant overall trend of crime dropping, right? And we've seen that in other places too. So comparative criminologists have referred to this as the global crime drop, right? All over the globe, seemingly, crime is dropping, right? So it peaked in about the mid-90s, depending on jurisdiction, depending on type of crime you're looking at, violent crime or property crime or all crime or whatever. It seems to have peaked somewhere in the mid-90s and has been dropping really, really significantly since. But at the same time, for some reason, people in these countries where crime has been dropping so significantly have been getting more and more and more scared of crime, and every year seemingly believing that crime is getting worse and worse and worse. This is a really, really interesting phenomenon from a criminological point of view. If crime is actually getting so much better according to every piece of data we have, why are people more and more scared of crime, and why do they think crime is getting worse? Now, of course, this doesn't mean not all crimes are going down. Not all countries have this overall crime drop, right? Like cybercrime has gone up in the past, 30, 40 years. But that's not necessarily due to traditional crime motivators. That's more due to more people have computers now. There are more and more people connected to the internet every day. And of course, not all countries, right? Some countries, a lot of countries have seen this drop. There are a few countries where crime has risen over the past 30 years. But a lot of that seems to be linked to national instability, i.e., is your nation going through some kind of crisis? Has a dictator been overthrown and a new government been put in, or has there been some major series of disasters, or some form of national instability is usually associated with this global crime drop not happening, right? So if your nation has some kind of big, overwhelming issues, then it is less likely to have seen this crime drop and is more likely to have seen crime rise. Now, why has crime dropped? This is a tough one. There are lots of ideas. Every criminologist in the world thinks they know, crime is dropping because of this, and crime is dropping because of that, and crime is dropping because of all these different issues. There's a famous book, which I'm not going to name, where they believe that the crime drop in the United States, the peak in the 90s and the drop afterwards, is due to the legalization of abortion in Roe v. Wade. I'm not so convinced on that one for two reasons. One, Roe v. Wade didn't really increase the amount of abortions that were happening that much in the early 1970s. And two, it was a global crime drop. I don't see how American law can cause a global crime drop. But the idea there is that in 1973, Roe v. Wade made abortion legal in the United States. And thus, the abortions that happened after that, those children, if they had been born, would have been at the perfect age in the mid-90s to become the most prevalent criminals. Late teens, early 20s is when criminality peaks. So the fact that we had abortions starting in the 70s, those kids didn't grow up in households that didn't want them, usually weren't financially able to take care of them, and thus they never became criminals. But again, Roe v. Wade really didn't increase the amount of abortions very much based on the estimates we have of pre-1973, and that doesn't explain the global crime drop. But some of the other suggestions are demographics. Just because we're living longer, the world is getting, on average, older. People are kind of clustering in cities and less rural areas. So maybe how people live and what the global demographic looks like might have changed how much crime is happening. Better policing. Maybe we're pretty good at catching criminals now, right? Maybe we've, thanks to DNA and, other kinds of investigative techniques, we are just better at catching the bad guys, and thus they don't commit as much crime. There's target hardening, i.e., crimes are more difficult to commit now. I will say for one thing, I recently bought a new car, and that car has all kinds of insane safety features that nobody would have dreamed of 20 or 30 years ago. So it's not that car theft is going down because fewer people want to steal cars. Car theft is going down because cars are a heck of a lot harder to steal now than they were in the 80s and 90s. Another idea is displacement, right? We a lot of times we don't count certain types of crime because they're harder to count. So for instance, we count auto theft, we count arson, we count homicide, but it's a lot more difficult, and we count things like cybercrime a lot less because there are associated difficulties with counting how much cybercrime is actually happening. So what if this crime drop isn't all crime dropping? It's that people who used to do other types of crime, which we do count, are now committing other kinds of crime which we don't count, i.e. things like cybercrime. So it's not that crime is going down, it's that the types of crime is shifting away from ones that are easy to count and get into our official statistics. There's also drugs. Drug use has gone down. Drug markets are a lot different than they were in the 80s and 90s. So that shift in drug use and drug selling behavior means the associated crimes that go with that have gone down, i.e. There are fewer drug addicts that need to burglarize homes in order to support their habit. Things like that. Now, homicide. Let's look at homicide specifically. Homicide has gone way down worldwide, right? The worldwide average was 10.2 per 100,000 people in 1980. That was roughly the peak of global homicide. By 2012, it was down to 6.2. That's an almost half in 30 years. That's pretty impressive. That is a remarkable drop in global homicide. It's still dropping. It's down to 6.1 in 2017, which were the latest numbers I could find. But as you can see, it's not going down as fast as it was between 1980 and 2012. But it is still down, which is a great thing. And then, of course, in the chart above, you can see that there's a very wide discrepancy in homicide depending on what part of the world you live in. So these different regions of the world have vastly different homicide rates, which makes it a little more difficult to make worldwide conclusions about what's happening and why. Now, drugs. How many drugs are being taken? How many drugs are being sold? This is a lot more difficult to measure, right? We could ask self-reports. Hey, have you smoked marijuana in the last 6 months? Have you taken cocaine in the last 6 months? But this is difficult because A, people tend to lie, and B, the very people that are doing drugs the most are the least likely to be involved in one of those interviews, right? So a lot of times what we use instead is seizures of drugs. The assumption there is that if we seize X percent of all drugs that are being imported into our country, and that percentage stays constant, then if we seize more, that means more is being imported and thus more is being consumed. And if that number goes down, the assumption is imports are going down and thus drug use is going down. But one of the biggest problems there, among many, is that we can't assume that the same percentage of all drugs being imported is seized. Maybe one year we have a really good year and seize 75% of all drugs that are entering the country, but the next year we only seize 20% of all the drugs entering the country. If we assume that drug seizures is related to drug use, it would look like there was a massive drop in drug imports in one year, when that's not necessarily true. But if we kind of combine lots of different measures, we can kind of assume that if they all agree on the trend, that trend is probably reflective of reality. So if we take self-reports and seizures and all those other hospital admissions and all kinds of things, and we put them all together, we can put together a picture that's probably pretty close to the truth. And when we do that, it looks like cannabis use, i.e. marijuana or Mary Jane, or, the drug has probably over 1,000 nicknames at this point. Worldwide, that's stable, maybe a slight decline, but cannabis is by far the most used illegal drug in the world. Although it's not illegal in every jurisdiction. There are a few states in the United States where you're legally able to toke up. There's a few countries where you're legally able to smoke marijuana. But overall, most of the world, it is illegal. And thus, it is kind of termed the most used illegal drug in the world. The downside is that opium and cocaine use both seem to be rising. Now, opium, by far the number one manufacturer of opium is Afghanistan. And when the U.S. military was there between 2001 and 2020, or 2021, I should say, in those 20 years, they attempted to reduce opium growing, and were not so successful. So opium, and if you don't know, opium is the plant shown in the picture there, that where they use that to make opium, morphine, heroin, everything you've ever heard of called an opiate is made from opium, which includes both legal, by prescription, and illegal drugs like heroin. So Afghanistan is by far the largest manufacturer of opium, and they have been ramping up production a lot in the last few years. Cocaine, obviously, famously comes from South and Central America, and both of those their use seems to be rising a lot, especially in the Western world. Now, terrorism. Terrorism, I'm going to reiterate, the definitions of crime vary, but terrorism is probably the absolute worst at this, okay? Terrorism, everybody and their dog has a different definition of what constitutes terrorism. The FBI has one definition, and the UK's police forces have another definition, and academics might have 5 definitions depending on which one you talk to, and it is really, really, really difficult to define the word terrorism. So this one is especially hard to track and compare country to country to country, region to region to region. But again, if we look at one jurisdiction over time, it becomes a little bit better because we can assume they're using the same definition, and thus we don't have to worry too much about those kinds of issues affecting the data, right? So I found this data from Europe specifically about terrorist attacks that were kind of failed, foiled, or completed. Failed, i.e. they tried to commit an attack and it didn't work. Foiled, it means they were planning it and actively, trying to go through with it when they were caught by police or some other authority figure. And completed are the ones where, unfortunately, the attack actually took place. And as you can see from the graph, there was a huge spike in the kind of 2012, 2013, 2014 era, but since then it's been going down. It's come down a lot. So the numbers for Europe are the numbers for Europe are there for 2008, but this graph is for the world from 1979 to 2019. So the graph, as you can see, pretty much agrees with the Europe data, where there's kind of a big peak in the kind of mid 2000s, 2010s, and then has been going down since. Now, other ways to measure crime rates. This is kind of an interesting question. Like, if we can't rely on victimization surveys for apparent, well, if victimization surveys aren't perfect for assorted reasons, and if official statistics aren't perfect for assorted reasons, what other data can we use to kind of back up those numbers? What other data can we look at? Because any one piece isn't good, but if we combine measures from a bunch of different things and put them all together, that's going to provide us a much more accurate view. So what about hospitals? hospital data, right? Now, at least in the United States and across most of the world, hospitals aren't allowed to give out specific medical information. But what they are allowed to do is give out kind of general mass data, i.e., in our hospital, we saw 52 gunshots in the last year. That's perfectly allowed to be released. So if we just ask a bunch of hospitals, hey, how many gunshots did you see in the last year? We can look at that data and combine it with other data to see how many shootings are happening. How many overdoses have you seen, over time? If the amount of overdoses that your state or city or country's hospitals have seen has gone up, we can assume that drug use has also gone up in roughly the same proportion. So hospital data on things like shootings, drug use, all kinds of other, children being admitted for physical injury can reflect on child abuse rates, things like that. By looking at those data and adding those to the other official statistics and victimization survey statistics, we can learn a lot more. We can also look at the media, right? The media, they are really good, especially in places where official statistics are hard to find, i.e. countries that are in crisis. If countries are at war, currently, as I'm recording this, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is going on, and there's probably not a lot of good official statistics on how much crime is happening. But the media and their ability to kind of go into countries in crisis, whether it's a war or a internal strife and nationwide protests like we saw with the Arab Spring a few years ago, the media, they'll give us kind of some idea of at least a little bit of what's happening. Now, the downside of using the media is obviously they want to show the most kind of sensational things. So that might make it a little difficult to get good data out of media analysis, but it'll at least give us some idea of what's going on in places where official statistics are either too far behind or unable to be obtained. And then one of my favorites is wastewater analysis. If you look at a city or even a region's, a neighborhood's wastewater, i.e., what do we flush down the toilet, we can tell, again, not individual, whether, Jim Bob at 1234 Main Street is doing drugs, but in the city as a whole, how many people are taking heroin? If we test the city's wastewater, we can tell, oh, there's this much, chemicals associated with opium use in the water, and then 6 months later, that number has gone way up. We can say, oh, heroin use has probably gone up because there's more of these chemicals and remnants associated with heroin use in the wastewater. So that's one way we can track drug use in a city or a neighborhood or some kind of network that is really pretty accurate. And in a non-criminal context, this wastewater analysis was very ingeniously used to track COVID infections, right? So I'm recording this in the summer of 2022, where we're hopefully on the decline for COVID cases worldwide, but the wastewater in certain cities was used by epidemiologists to figure out where is COVID rising, where is it falling, but they tested the wastewater in assorted different cities over time, every day or every week, and they were able to see how much kind of COVID identifiable remnants were in that wastewater and able to tell, oh, cases are going up in this city, and then another city would be, oh, cases are going down here. We should send resources from that second city to the first city. So it's really kind of an ingenious way to track the rates of assorted social ills, from crime to infection, in large groups of people. Now, that's the end of section 3. I really, really appreciate you guys watching. See you for section 4.